Yeah, I suppose for a long time I was probably representative of a lot of mainstream journalists who didn't see and don't, and in other cases don't see the WASH as a distinct sector of coverage. When I was in Uganda and was covering stories about internally displaced peoples who had come from the north of the country into the peri-urban regions in and around Kampala, and there were a lot of WASH issues in covering that story. But at the time, I didn't see myself as covering the WASH stories within that. So, especially because we have two sides: the WASH sector, where WASH is front of mind, and it's a very distinct sector and topic, and on the other hand, journalists who may be inadvertently covering WASH without seeing it as a distinct topic. So there's a lot of room for both sides to sort of better understand where each other is coming from, so that everybody can talk together when they talk, rather than sort of talking at each other from two very different perspectives. In many cases, WASH stories are clearly newsworthy. They're critical to health. They're critical to the populations that are affected to whatever WASH issue is being discussed. Where I think where the gap can be in terms of whether a WASH story is covered or not covered isn't necessarily the why piece. It's because it's newsworthy, but the why now piece, because a lot of WASH issues are big picture, long-term, sustained issues, or at least can be seen that way. And a lot of issues fall through that crack in the news media, and that where there's a lot of ongoing crises that get coverage because they so easily answer that why now question. It's newsworthy now because this crisis is spiked, and it's newsworthy now. And it's become particularly important in the last few years, where the news cycle is moving to a never-ending, the 24/7 news cycle that we talk about so often. It's ongoing and never-ending. So those decisions are being made very quickly and in rather like short-term increments. We as the WASH sector can go some degree to helping to bridge that gap when we're looking at WASH issues and how we can increase coverage of those WASH issues, whether it's helping to frame the issue as part of a trend and providing supporting statistics and people available for interviews to support that trend. If it's a localized WASH issue, looking at the impacts one way or another on the affected community, so that it comes to the editor who is making those decisions as not only a story that's newsworthy, but a story that's newsworthy right now. There's a lot of WASH sector specific, websites and blogs and newsletters, but when we're stepping outside the sector into mainstream, it's so difficult to find one mainstream media source to go to and get that reliable stream of WASH coverage. And if you notice a couple of really good WASH-related stories in the BBC or the New York Times, if you notice that in a big media outlet when that happens, starting to follow that media outlet doesn't necessarily mean you'll suddenly be getting a lot more WASH coverage, because it can be haphazard and unpredictable. So really, I rely on a lot of Google alerts, starting really broad. I have a Google alert for water, sanitation, and hygiene, and I get an email that comes in. Sometimes comes in multiple times a day with a whole massive stream of stories that have included that term. But the benefit of that is that it's allowed me to spot a lot of stories, especially niche regional stories, that I would never have otherwise had come across my desk. Yeah, one example that comes to mind, and hopefully also helps us as a sector work together and communicate on how we can encourage, stimulate, and support more coverage of WASH issues in the media, was that in Liberia, at the newspaper I was working at, we started an initiative that was based around stimulating a lot of community-based reporting. One of the challenges, and it was I think it came up in the webinar we hosted recently, is the lack of local voices in in media coverage. It's a lot of press conferences, a lot of government officials. That's where a lot of stories start. How can we get more community voices into local media coverage so that not only are they represented, but they're also helping to drive what issues are covered, what issues are important to them. That kind of reporting results in coverage of WASH issues, and that's one way we as a sector can kind of back into getting more coverage in mainstream media, because WASH issues are important to people in their communities. So if you're talking to people and asking them what are important issues affecting you, WASH comes up again and again and again. One thing that's more timely that I've been following of late, and that I think all of us in the WASH sector would do well to follow and contribute to, is the Guardian newspaper in the UK have their global development blog, and they've recently launched a focus on WASH issues, and which is great to see. And also recently they put out a call to the WASH sector for ideas and input on topics and things they should be covering. So it's examples like that where when we see that opportunity, we should be contributing and following and reinforcing that, so that when there is an example of a mainstream media showing interest in, not just interest in WASH, but also interest in the WASH sector, providing input and guidance on what coverage should be done, we should not only contribute to that, but very much positively reinforce it, support those initiatives, follow the stories, share the stories, because that's what will really drive a lot of that decision making, is if media outlets sort of take a step into the WASH territory and see that they're entering a very vibrant community where there's a lot of input and support and readership and dialogue happening, they'll be much more likely to step back into that space.